few years ago, I was really curious about why the world is how it is, and I got into economics in a big way. I did a sort of 3-year dive of reading loads of books and so on. I've just given you a handout to do with economics. And what you tend to find from that kind of study is there's lots of information about why things are wrong and what we should do about it. So it's quite hard to take it in how bad things are at the minute, and this is just the miserable bit of the talk, and hopefully it gets a bit better in a bit. The system that we live under currently is deadly. I know you all know this. You know, we're heading towards, if not already in the 6th mass species extinction. The last one was the dinosaurs. We've already lost half of all wildlife in 40 years. It's dangerous. There are 14 known characteristics of fascism, and we have them all live and kicking and on the rise at the minute. It's miserable, it's deeply unequal. Something like 7 people own the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the poorest folks. And when you get that level of inequality, and the UK's the 3rd most unequal country in the world, if not the 2nd after Portugal and the US, everybody suffers. You have more obesity, more mistrust, lower life expectancy, mental illness and depression. It's not fun to live in this society how it is. It's deeply corrupted. It's a form of corruption that's very westernised. It's not the kind of what's called collusive corruption, in which bribes are handed over. I'm not saying that never happens, but it's a more institutionalised form of corruption. It's somehow about skirting the law. And one of the key places that happens is through what we call secrecy jurisdictions in an organisation I've worked with, the Tax Justice Network. We know that of order, $13 trillion are held offshore. So, sorry, £13 trillion is $20 trillion. If you put a dollar bill on the floor and stack them up to the moon, that amount of money would go to the moon and back 4 times. Half of the world's wealth goes through tax havens. And they're not just about keeping tax lowered or zero for rich corporations, rich people. They're about the avoidance of regulation, the avoidance of law, the avoidance of transparency. Political donations go through them, and we know there was a level of electoral fraud in the UK in 2015. Not cool. It's also immutable. This system will not change. It doesn't mean it's not worth trying to do reformist things and change from within. This is not an either-or conversation. But basically, we have the fossil fuel infrastructure already in place to take us to 3.5 degrees of warming. And we know in the Paris Agreement we're supposed to stop at 1.5 degrees. And yet, I was up at Preston New Road this weekend, where they're trying to start fracking. Fossil fuel explorations continue. It's madness, isn't it? It doesn't want to change. So anyway, we tend to know what the problems are if you look deeply into this, and we actually know what change is needed. And if you look on the back of the handout, there's a bit of a draft manifesto. It's just a gathering of some of the great ideas that are out there. So Zero Carbon Britain have already defined in great detail how Britain could be a zero carbon economy. Brilliant. Polly Higgins has written an amazing law, an international law, the law of ecocide, which would deal with some of the ecocide crimes and the results of the climate crisis. The Tax Justice Network know in great detail, it's terribly boring when you get into the detail, how to tackle tax dodging. You have to have unitary taxation and country-by-country reporting. We've got these geeks that have worked this stuff out. The issue is not what we should do. So the issue is how do you see the change? Which is why I sort of moved on from studying economics, because actually you could say it in one word, which is when Mrs. Thatcher said there is no alternative, there are loads of alternatives. So the question then is how? You know, how are we going to see this change? And like my heart beats to know this, really, and I think probably you're in this room for those same reasons. A really good book worth reading is A Complete Theory of Revolution by Mika White. Oh, sorry, the book is actually called A New Playbook for Evolution, and he gives a complete theory within it. And in that, he looks at the different theories that are around that talk about how things change. And actually, it goes from very material things to very spiritual things, from very subjective things where you can do things to very objective where you're not in charge. So, to pick one of them, perhaps the most esoteric and harder one to get your head around is theurgism, which is the idea that something outside of the everyday reality could provoke change, some kind of divine intervention. And that could be evoked through magic, ceremony and prayer. Now, I'm not asking anybody to believe in that, but certain people have religious and spiritual beliefs, and they'll be out with bookstores trying to get more people on their side and so on. It is increasingly in activist circle. At Preston New Road last weekend, there was a beautiful water ceremony by the Warriors Call, Pagans Against Fracking. Really touched my heart, a way of honouring the water. And I guess, if nothing else, and I think it does do bigger things personally, but that's just my personal belief, it's about really bringing in your desire to see change from a heart place, from a real kind of passionate place. When it comes from your head and from guilt and panic, it's not very sustainable. So that's why I personally think that's useful stuff. Starhawk writes books about it, and in the Dakota Access Pipeline, it's been slightly more normalised because it's led by Indigenous people, and that's part of their way. So I guess in some ways related to that is subjectivism. It's this idea that in order to change the outer reality, we have to change our inner reality. We have to do what some people call inner work. You know, where are the places where we manifest the racism and the sexism and the classism and so on in our own behaviours? Where are the places where we don't look after ourselves and love ourselves enough? And there's this idea that somehow if you did enough of that, that you would create some kind of mass epiphany and the world would change. So that's the people that want to sit on mats meditating and doing yoga, and I do a lot of that stuff too. There's some really important work there, I think, that's about really deeply connecting to nature, not just having this theoretical understanding that nature supports us, but being out there, being with her and feeling that connection. Really worth checking out Charles Eisenstein, who uses phrases like a new story of the people and talks about the great turning in that space. And so I think you're getting the picture that I think all of these are valid and should be part of what we consider doing. In Rising Up, we're embracing all of these, but we're not expecting people to participate in everything. We're not forcing anybody onto a yoga mat. If nothing else, what we're doing is trying to drag people off yoga mats and say, hey, you've done a lot of that, you know, come and get on the front lines with us as well. So structuralism is the idea that forces outside of our control, such as food price hikes, can trigger a revolutionary moment. That would be very strong in Marxist theory, I guess, and I and others set up Rising Up. One of the people was Roger Hallam from Radical Think Tank, and they've set up something called the Cobra Committee. If anybody wants to be involved in that, look at Radical Think Tank, it's great. So what we're looking at there are being ready for when a moment happens. It might be called a moment of the whirlwind, when suddenly people are awake. So can we capitalise on that? Is there something that we could do about it? It's happened twice last year, once with Brexit and with Trump being elected. And for example, with Brexit, we decided to organise a picnic. We just were the first people to get up the Facebook page and say, come and have a picnic, let's have a chat about this, how do you feel? Do you want to join a group that's going to do something about this? And we managed to match people up to groups that they could be involved in. Because it was interesting, Brexit. You know, the morning after Brexit, I had 2 or 3 friends of mine contact me going, Gail, you know, I'm what's happening? You're the most political person I know. Tell me what's happening. And what I thought to myself afterwards was, what's happening is you're happening. You know, you're noticing that big things are happening in the world and you're not really plugged into it. You know, you're feeling disassociated from it but frightened by it. So structuralism. The talk's going to focus on voluntarism, and this is the idea that change can come through the assertion of our collective and individual will. And I suspect it won't just come from that without some of the others, actually. But that's the bit that we can focus on as in groups and organisations, whilst bringing in some of the elements of the others. In fact, I think a key issue for Rising Up at the minute is figuring out the sequencing of these things. When do we need to pause and really do inner work and really connect to each other? So voluntarism is about several different things. One is it could just simply be voting, you know, vote for this party and so on. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that one. For some people, they think that educating the next generation is the most important thing, and certainly, you know, that's a key issue. I think it's also really important we don't put on our children our own despair, that we let them know that we're taking charge of this stuff and we're going to sort it out. But enabling children to feel confident and held in the world is useful. Another thing within voluntarism is creating new models, so permaculture, or whether it's Bitcoin, some form of new monetary system that we could use in the future. We've also done local currencies, this kind of thing, workers' co-ops. There's lots and lots of examples. So each one of those things has its own theory of change behind it. We need to create the new way so that we're ready, or we need to educate the children. And it's really useful to think what the pros and cons are of each, so that if you're more in one camp than another, just be mindful that somebody else who's working in a different camp, if you like, you're not in opposition, you are all working towards something bigger than yourselves. So voluntarism, so the idea that we can make change by deciding that we're going to make change. There's some really useful literature in this space. Saul Alinsky was one of the earlier people that looked at, in his main book is Rules for Radicals, looked at how to do one-to-one organising with people within groups. So trade unionism would look quite a lot like that. And then other people have focused on the idea of massive protests, of getting loads and loads of people on the street. And for quite some years there was an argument between those two camps, especially in the US, about which was better. And then people started to hybridise them. The two main obvious people that did that were Martin Luther King, the people he worked with, and Gandhi. And when they started to hybridise that model, they were a lot more successful. So the two things are really important. To have an organisation that people can be involved in, but also to do big things because it gets noticed, it gets people's interest. One of the other things to really pay attention to is this idea of power. When we're in our despair, we tend to think that power lies in the media or in the corporations or in the government, and then we feel powerless. Hannah Arendt is a political theorist who was very clear, and along with Gene Sharp and others, that power lies in the collective, that systems are enabled by all of us being okay with the system being how it is. So then the obvious key question becomes, how do you act as a collective, which is something that we are dealing with and thinking about in Rising Up and have some tools for. And then, the other thing that people say to me is, what about the Daily Mail readers? God, the Daily Mail readers, are we ever going to convert the Daily Mail readers? Well, interestingly, we don't need to convert the Daily Mail readers, thank goodness. I think we should look after them and be kind to them and listen to them and figure out where they're coming from, what pain lies behind some of the things that, some of the unpleasant things that come out of that publication. And I'm not just picking on the Daily Mail, but, I'm talking about. Erica Chenoweth was a woman who had a career pathway in the military, and she heard a lot about non-violent civil resistance and was sure that this was probably nonsense, that people like Gene Sharp were talking about how people could defend their country through non-violent civil resistance. And so she took it upon herself to do the detailed research, and she studied over 330 different significant moments of revolution or big social change processes. And what she found was, first of all, it is better when it's non-violent. Doesn't mean that violent revolutions have never succeeded, but when it's non-violent, it's more likely to be stable and it's more likely to be successful, stable in the longer term. And the other thing she figured out is that you need up to 3.4% actually of the population to rise up and be in active rebellion for change to happen. That's probably the number that gets me out of bed on the morning and excited. Because in the UK, that's 2.2 million people, and there are 10 million people that vote Green on Labour, and lots of people that don't vote or vote alternative, smaller parties, independent, and so on. I think there are already 2 million people in the UK that know this system's fucked and want to do something about it. So then we have to create a vehicle for them to rise up and act as a collective. Tim G, if you want to read one book on all of this, I would recommend this one, This Is an Uprising. But another great book is Tim G's Counterpower, where again he's done an analysis of lots of successful social movements and seen that there's a pathway that's required. It has 4 stages in it, the 4 C's. He talks about consciousness, where you have to raise awareness of what the issue is. Coordination, where you need to get different groups working together. That's really important because we tend to say like meets like. And then when you get your moment of change, you need to consolidate it. You need to have ready the policies and so on that you want to see the change for. So that's, again, on the back of the handout, that they already exist, a lot of them. The key moment, the key thing, the third C that we tend to not really focus on quite so much, especially within the world of NGOs, is the necessary step of confrontation. That's been a key part of social movements, that people were disobedient. I'm not a confrontational person. I was like a straight A, girly swat, top of the year student. You know, it makes me feel quite worried whenever I do anything. I'm really rubbish at that. Actually, it's quite funny. I tend to encourage people to practice their disobedience. So there's some stickers here. I tell people that you can, they're to do with the media, that you can put them on a free newspaper and you won't have broken the law, and maybe put them where else you like and don't get caught, and see how you feel about it. It's quite interesting watching your own barriers to disobedience. And by the way, I just want to say that for the uprising, 3.5% of the population being active, it doesn't require everybody to be breaking the law. Lots of us are needed to write press releases, to do the filming, take good photographs, to support people after an action, to do the movement care stuff, to do the admin and so on. So I would never say that a given person has to put pressure on person or anything like that. For some people it's quite dangerous, depending, especially if they have an immigrant status or whatever, if they've got kids, so on. So it's a personal choice, but some of us need to, and we need to support the people that do. Gene Sharp wrote a series of books. He's like the father of this area, I guess. Dictatorship to Democracy was translated into many languages and was part of the Arab uprisings. And in that, he said it's really important to have a strategy, a grand narrative, and also sub-strategies and so on, not just to be doing stuff. The Occupy movement's a good example of a movement that went viral because it had something special about it. You could copy it without needing permission. That's really cool. But it didn't have enough in what we start to call its DNA. It tended to just have two things, really. One was its grand narrative, which turned out to be, we are the 99%. That was great, it caught on. And the second thing was its tactic, which was occupation. But if that's your tactic, that's your one tactic, when they clear you off, you're done with. So it's important to have a range of tactics. And in terms of tactics, this is an uprising, gives lots of details, and I'll come on to that shortly. And Carlos Saavedra gave me and a bunch of other people training last summer. He's from the Aini Institute, and he's supported many social movements, in particular the movements of undocumented migrants in the States. He has Peruvian heritage. So it's a real honour, I guess, to have this rooted in the global south, who actually are much better at doing this than we are, generally. Radical think tank Roger Hanlon had also come up with a bunch of tactics. So one of them is what's called conditional commitment. It's the idea of, I'll do it if you'll do it. And Roger Hanlon has, and through Radical Think Tank, helped to organise the successful UCL rent strike through this conditional commitment. I'll do it if you'll do it, and also the Deliveroo strike. And what we've got on Rising Up is a mechanism, it's a database where people can post, I'll do it if you'll do it. And the trade union movement is the start of that, I'll strike if you'll strike. And when people know that there's solidarity there and then they dare do it and it's worth taking that action, that's what has underpinned social change in this country, that conditional commitment. So it's really important. We talk about pledging to do something. So we're talking about this need to be confrontational. And it's really clear when you look back in history, and we have a bit of a run through on the Rising Up website of examples of civil disobedience, but just to quickly headline some of them. Your right to roam and the national parks came from mass trespassers and Kinder Scout, both in the 30s and in the 90s. Your vote came from the Chartists and the suffragettes. The Chartists were the first to organise big protests around voting, and the suffragettes copied, and they had to always do it twice as big. And they got criticised for smashing windows, but that's what the Chartists had done, and that's what worked. It was disruptive, it made a noise. The prevention of genetic modification in the UK was people that I know who went and pulled up the crops. And they wrote a booklet saying how to get rid of genetically modified crops. and they were told on no account must you share that book, so they just shared, and Prince Charles was filmed sharing it. So it's that whole thing of when more people are disobedient, then it's powerful. Indian independence, there was the salt tax satyagraha that Gandhi led. American independence, you've heard of the Boston Tea Party. The whole civil rights movement in America was about breaking unjust laws. And go back to Gene Sharp about from dictatorship to democracy. I feel that we have a form of dictatorship. Like, you can have neoliberalism or neoliberalism or neoliberalism. You just get different versions of it. If that's not a dictatorship, I don't know. I think it's a sort of mature form of a system which gives the appearance of being able to change things, which gives the appearance of democracy and the right to protest. But in reality, it wants to get you to ask for permission to march, and then stop your march and fuck off home again and be done with, so that you can all feel like you've done something. You have to be doing something more edgy, in all honesty. I'm not saying it's not important to march. Sometimes I like singing on marches and handing out leaflets, but they don't tend to be the only way to get change to happen. So there are current things happening, disabled people against courts, Black Lives Matters. There's been lots of actions around Heathrow that Rising Up's been part of, anti-fracking movements, trade unions, toll puddle, rent laws, Luddite uprising, diggers, Spanish eviction resistance, poll tax. There's loads of examples out there, so it's not a one-off. But it's also important to think about what causes things to fail, because things have been successful in that way, neoliberalism, which is basically like capitalism on crack cocaine, has figured out how to suppress movements. The gagging law was passed to stop, I think, especially 38 Degrees from being quite so powerful around the election. The trade unions have been attacked, teeth has been removed, and we turn NGOs into businesses, a process some call NGOisation. There tends to be a liberalisation, let's keep it nice, let's be polite and so on, that perhaps fits to our British mentality. If you can, go and see 3 Acres and a Cow show about the history of revolution and uprisings in the UK, because we need to know our history to know our power. We've just not been taught it. And then within groups you get problems of power and privilege, the manifestation of racism and sexism. You don't really know who's in charge and how do you make the power explicit, accountable, effective. Is there really a diversity of voices? It's this idea of somebody being in charge versus autonomy. Can quite often have this London centricity where we all feel like we're getting called into London for quite a lot of things, not always the wrong thing. Activists burn out. It's where the self-care is really important. In some organisations you have these consensus processes that feel beautiful, but actually they take up a lot of time and you feel like you're going to die by the end of it, slashing your wrist because they're very slow. So what can we do about that kind of thing? Trying to work out when it's appropriate to use demands. Sometimes you can have prophetic demands. This system must change. We must have a 10% reduction in carbon every year, or very specific demands like we want country-by-country reporting for corporations to stop tax dodging, or no third runway at Heathrow. It's important to be clear, to use both of those types actually. And the old issue of recruitment, getting people involved, tend to get more of the same people. Sometimes activist groups can get very over-bonded with each other, and if you come on the outside and you're interested, their culture's not explicit, there's no way in for you, it's not done deliberately, but there's the feeling then of a clique or something like that. And yeah, if you don't stay connected to the people you're working with, you can get into isolation. This comes from our relationships, it doesn't come from just an intellectual agreement that we need to be doing change together. And it's also really useful, I think, to understand our who's in that 3.5% in the UK. Another really useful book to read is George Lakoff, Don't Think of an Elephant. You can get the PDF for free. The first chapter covers the whole lot. I just read the book because it was cool. And he talks about how there are two main frames in the world. One, the strict father, it's a man, it's the patriarchy. He's in charge, you do what he says. Can be fronted by a woman like Theresa May, but it's a strict father model. You do what I say and you get rewarded, you don't do what I say and you get punished. People are inherently bad and they need discipline and to be controlled. And when people are fearful, they want this father figure who tells them what to do. You know, that's a thing. And when the society is very unequal, they want somebody to blame. So the system tends to feed itself when you have a strict father model running. Of course, you have one strict father who feels that they're right compared to another strict father, the Islamic version or the Western version or whatever, and they're going to get into wars with each other. It's not a helpful frame, but people relate to it. And then there's another frame called the nurturant parent, the one that recognises that children are inherently good, that they need strong boundaries, but they need lots of love, that no one person can raise a child, you need a community, you need cooperation. And people that recognise that frame tend to be progressives. But we make a mistake of using the language of the strict father model. So an example is around taxation. The strict father talks about tax relief. How dare you tax me? You know, I'm an independent, autonomous person. I don't want governments telling me what to do. In the nurture and parent model, you should never talk about tax relief. Talk about taxation as a contribution to society, as your membership dues or whatever. So it's important what language we use. And then it's important to recognise that we tend to be a particular type of progressive. And when you look at this list here, I don't know which ones you are, I won't read them all out. I tend to hang out with environmentalists and spiritual progressives and anti-authoritarians. And I created an organisation a couple of years ago called Compassionate Revolution, and the spiritual progressives loved it. The anti-authoritarians were like, what the fuck's this, you know? It's like it sounds wet to them. I'm not wet, but it's important to use language. So rising up is in that way trying to be quite a neutral, maybe slightly boring, but signifier. So based on reflecting on the fact that what we're doing doesn't seem to have been enough, a bunch of people started to have a conversation from Earth First, Radical Think Tank, Compassionate Revolution, Plain Stupid, Reclaim the Power, and Occupy, and there was a Bristol group called Rising Up as well. We recognised something, we had to do something different. So we started meeting last April, so this is really early days, and started thinking about what strategy would look like, what tactics we should use, what our story and structure should be. And I'm going to quickly rattle through that. I won't be able to go through it in detail. Online there are certain packs and documents and so on. There's a few packs for people who are really interested at the front. So our grand strategy in the language of Gene Sharp is that we know we need to enable a mass movement, escalating a programme of ongoing disruptive actions as part of a grand narrative that says the system's toxic. And that we need to create a movement big enough that it can insist upon change. And by virtue of how it operates, it also acts as a model for how society can run differently. And we need to embed that change through a much improved democracy and support a vision of what the change should be. And there's lots of sub-strategies within that. For example, we say that the system's held together by certain pillars. I'll maybe come to that in a second. So we're trying to draw on state-of-the-art knowledge and experience gleaned from global mass movements. And what's really important here is that you make your culture explicit, that you try and say what you are so that people know and they don't have to feel like an idiot when they're trying to get involved. So we need to define what we're about, what we're saying is wrong, and how it could be changed, how we're going to go about trying to change it, and how we organise. So that's the story, strategy and structure. And this is from the Carlos Saavedra training. He calls that your movement DNA. Be clear about what that is and define it. And this is really useful for any organisation to think like this. So what we do is, first of all, evoking a non-violent discipline, and we've been very careful about defining what we mean by non-violence without going into great detail. So some people break into property in order to do a protest. We don't have a problem with that, but random breaking of stuff we don't feel is going to be useful. So you need to combine that with a proactive and inclusive DNA training to tell people what you're about. And to an extent I'm doing a bit of that today, but it'll be a rapid one. And try to create a mass participation. So you basically have this cycle where you do an action and people notice you, and then you have some kind of moment of working with people now interested in you. And it's a bit of a horrible word in a way, but you sort of absorb people into your movement. You've told them how they can participate. And then you can do a bigger action. At the same time, within that, we need to think about the times when we need to pause and reflect and to look after ourselves, so on. what we're doing is saying that once people know what a rising up's about, they can just be rising up. You know, they can do whatever they like within that DNA. So nobody could go and, I don't know, deface a Jewish cemetery and say it's rising up, because like that's so totally against our safer spaces policy. But they could occupy a university building, they could be doing protests about the austerity and so on. It's the whole spectrum. So this avoids the pitfalls of centralised models, and it's about releasing creativity and initiative, a bit like the Occupy movement, but with more behind it. That's the idea. Trying to safeguard what's at the heart of the movement, but free up the energy. So one of the tactics is that actually you have to polarise the public and win active support. So for any given issue, there tends to be people who are actively working for that issue, people who passively agree but aren't doing anything. It might be a whole pile of neutral people, people that are against you, but not doing anything, people are actively working against you. And the idea is to move the neutral and the passively agreeing people over to your side. And you might in that process entrench some other people who are like, this is not okay, we're really against these people. That's just inevitable, and it's not a problem. In fact, it helps people to choose which side they're on. So an example of that was the people in ACT UP who were fighting for AIDS research and for gay people to be treated properly who had AIDS at the time. It was in the 80s, it was called a gay plague. It was a terrible time for gay people. And also the people who've worked for gay marriage. On lots of those issues, for no bad reason, people just wouldn't have had an opinion. And what ACT UP did was very disruptive. I think possibly the worst thing they did on Christmas Eve was went and disrupted a Catholic Mass. Not totally lovely for people. Some people might have thought they overstepped a boundary, but they got noticed. And then you'll get people like the Westboro Baptist Church who go into ravage homophobia. And then the rest of us go, whoa, we're not like them. And we step over into at least passive agreement with the goals of ACT UP. And so sometimes being disruptive is helpful. And this is Rising Up last Tuesday, being disruptive. 3 people chained themselves to a car in the Heathrow Tunnel. And there was a lot of people whose flights and day was disturbed as a result. And we're not pleased about that. We don't think that's cool. But 5 people made headlines and have got Rising Up noticed. And unfortunately, that's just how it is sometimes. It's part of what needs to happen. My friend Jane Rose organised the knitting of a peace scarf to say no to Trident, and people across the whole world participated in this. It was a 7-mile scarf. It went from Aldermaston to Berghaven, I think it's called, where Trident's being built. And when she calculated it, 25 years of knitting had gone into it. It's beautiful pink bits of scarf. They all got sewn together, and it didn't get in the news. It got in the regional news. So it's lovely, and it helped to bond loads of people. It nearly bloody killed Jane, bless her, for organising that. I don't mean it didn't have a purpose to it, but in terms of raising awareness of Trident, it didn't work. 5 people. So you try to schedule escalation. So more disruption, but it has to be grounded on capacity as well. And this is where we're at with Rising Up at the minute, is just trying to build ourselves as a movement. And one of the things you can do is try to create win-win scenarios for yourself as a movement by using what's called dilemma actions. So these are actions that whatever the authorities do, they look a bit daft. If they repress you, people go, oh, that's not okay. And if they let you get away with it, then you're free to carry on acting. So a really good example of that would be in the Serbian Revolution, which was a really cool movement, actually. I think it's called Blueprint for a Revolution, if you want to read more about that. But in order to participate, you had to graffiti a fist. You had to do 10 of them. There was no just chatting your way into this movement. You did 10 graffitis and you were in. And that suddenly meant that all over was this graffiti, and that freaked out the authorities, and it raised people's interest that somebody was standing up, somebody wasn't as scared. And then the younger folks started having parties on the streets because you weren't allowed to, but they weren't protesting, they were just having parties. And then they get arrested, and the parents were like, whoa, they were just having a party. So the arrests were helpful. And when you got an arrest, you got a T-shirt, When you got 10 arrests, you got a black t-shirt and you were super cool and everybody wanted to have sex with you. So it's probably another thing, we need to have sex and humour in our movements as well. And they were brilliant with humour. So what they did was to write on ping pong balls anti-Slobodan Milosevic slogans. And Belgrade, the capital, has got lots of steps in it, and they go to the top of the steps and pour these ping pong balls that go bouncing down. Police would be desperately trying to catch these balls because you can't talk in looking like idiots, you know. So they either left the slogans or they look like idiots. In either case, the people smiled and they got that bit of confidence back. The Dreamers movement, which Carlos Saavedra's part of, they had to go through a process a bit like the gay rights protests, whereby people had to come out and say, I'm an undocumented migrant. So the racism against undocumented migrants go that there are these hidden people in society, let's blame them for society's evils, they're rapists, they're drug dealers, and then, hey, no, they're coming out and actually it's my friend's mum, who I really like. And then they built from that and they offered the American people a day of service where they said, we're going to give blood. And the blood banks were like, hallelujah, we're running out of blood, we desperately need an influx of blood. And the equivalent of the Home Office were like, oh, so we're going to arrest people while they're giving blood. And they didn't arrest them, and then people gaining confidence. So that's dilemma actions. So it's designing actions that have that about them. The other thing, and I get like into graphs a bit here, but is thinking about how we can create actions that are inclusive. So when I'm talking about acts of disobedience, sometimes it can feel like a spectator sport. You know, Greenpeace do this amazing thing, you're all like happy days, and then we're asked to pay some money towards them, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but you know, where did we get to participate in a civil disobedience? So what would tend to happen is if you plot risk against numbers involved, there tends to be more people up for doing something not very risky, you know, spending some money, signing a petition, a few people that would take a risk that would get them over the arrest line. And for any given dilemma action, you're saying what you're trying to get out of that action. So it might be that you want to have a meeting with King's College about divestment. Roger Hallam at the minute is currently leading a group that's doing ongoing graffiti, and you can join in on Saturday if you want to participate. It's just with poster paint, washes off easily, so it's another bit of a dilemma for the authorities. So if that was your win, was that, let's say, King's College are going to have a meeting with you, you might need to shift your numbers from here up to this line here. And actually, so it's really useful if you can animate this middle block in this area, somewhere near the arrest line, but possibly not. It's what my friend Jojo calls peaceful mischief. So if lots and lots of us do something that's not that bad, fewer of us have to do the heavy risk things. Although the big risk things are really useful because they signify to people, they inspire people. By talking to you like this, I'm probably committing a crime called counselling. And by some of the things that are up on the website, I could probably get accused of conspiracy as well. And I've heard what implications that might be. I've already got a necessity defence for myself and other colleagues in Rising Up. And frankly, I've got to a place with this where if that's necessary, then that's what I'll have to do. It's just how it is. But hopefully, more of you would go, right, peaceful mischief time then. So there are lots of other tactics. We talked about conditional commitment, I will if you will. There's also attrition actions where lots of people do something to disrupt an organisation. So last week we were organising a communications blockade of Quadrilla, the frackers, and AEA as part of the supply chain, just ringing them up. There's nothing illegal with ringing people up. But for a small organisation, it turned out it looked like they had hired some people to be the front line on the desk. Their staff would have had to have notices. It's not cool for an organisation. It can wear them down. Fracking is on a real borderline in terms of its viability financially, so it's useful doing things like that. Swarm actions are where you have semi-autonomous groups acting differently, but for the same end. So in principle, we could shut down London if that felt like a useful thing to do. If groups of people just went on the streets, sat in the road, sat there for all time and went off again, you don't need to all act in concert, but you need to know that a certain number of groups are doing that. That may be the kind of response that ought to happen if Trump comes to the UK. It's a way of saying no to this system. So in Rising Up, we're aiming to be a social movement. We're not yet. There's about 2,000 people on the database. There's about 50 to 60 active people and a core group of people holding it together. But, 2,000 people, just times it by 1,000, and we've hit the 2 million. It's like, let's be optimistic. We're trying to be different by naming the central issue by saying the system's fucked. And we're trying to say that there are many symptomatic problems, climate change, health issues, war, inequality, but actually they all come back to a systemic issue. And so we're quite happy for any actions to take place on a number of fronts. But when you read Gene Sharp, he says it's useful to point your energy at the pillars that hold the system in place. And we think that includes the finance sector, the fact that democracy is broken, and the media. It's not to say we'll just do actions about them, but it's good to, we're going to spend some time thinking about doing those kinds of actions. We go into some detail saying what the problem is, and there's just like a bunch of people going, oh, the system needs to change, there's an analysis there. And also it's useful to, we're talking about the profit-based system, the debt-based system, the demand for economic growth, the corruption, the democracy being decimated, the deep inequality, and the pressure to compete over cooperation, the pressure to be individuals rather than communities, rather than building villages. But actually, we just want to go a bit deeper and say, few of us feel really good in this system, that future generations are insecure, and we tend to forget our interdependence and our reliance on nature. And actually what we really want to say is that nobody's to blame for this system. There's a beautiful way in which Charles Eisenstein talks about that. When you get in really cross with the Eton boys and what they're up to, it's just, I experience them as people in deep despair who filled their despair vacuum up with power. And I don't know what it's like going to a public school. I don't know what their stories are, but perhaps I'd be doing just the same thing if I'd walked in their shoes. Doesn't really feel helpful to blame, which is not to say we don't want to stop corrupted power. And we're also saying that we need to change. We do need to do that inner work. We need to be mindful of power and focus on diversity and inclusion. And we need to practice new forms of democracy. So I mentioned the issue of consensus-based decision-making. It's not to say consensus is wrong, especially if it's in a small group, it works really well. We are trying to work with a system called holocracy, which is basically that people are empowered to do a job when they've agreed to take it on. And they should take advice and feedback from a few people, but it's up to them. So whoever's doing the press release, get on with it. Whoever's running the social media, get on with it. You don't have to ask everybody's permission and question things. We've written things down that ought to act as guidelines, but it's up to you. If it didn't work, maybe reflect on it. It's really important to have reflection and debriefs. We've talked about the solutions. We've got a draft manifesto. We're basically saying that we want an economy to maximise well-being and minimise harm. We're not saying that we want anarcho-syndicalism, whatever that is, and or communism or socialism, because I don't really know, probably a lot of that is to do with who we are and how we can relate to each other. And it will emerge from how strong we are as a community, I think. But fundamentally, democracy is about informed consent. It's about having really good information and having a discussion. So in a way, we've set up, it will always be a draft manifesto. These are some of the things that could change, but it's open to discussion. And another Gene Sharp thing is it's really important to say what you're for and not just what you're against, because it's what you're really calling for that matters. So we've written a vision that says we really want an inclusive world where individuals are supported to express their unique gifts, where we work together to support our community, to create beautiful things, and to tackle the major problems of our age. That our lives will have the meaning we long for, we will uphold the best in our humanity for a greater purpose. And I think within that vision, most people, I've never met anybody who can't sign up to that actually. I'm sure people will exist. But it's then, therein lies a whole debate about how you run a money system and so on. So I've talked about our structure. that we're into small group decision making. There's a small strategy group. We think about what are the good dates for actions, and we take feedback. And we have some working groups looking at how do we embed movement care, how do we debrief this stuff, and so on. We've defined a set of principles and values, things like safer spaces and non-violence. I'm not going to go into those today, but they're written up. And we've taken some actions already. So we sort of launched off the back of Reclaim the Powers action on October the 1st at Heathrow. On November the 19th, we'd had a conditional commitment in which 100 people said they were willing to get arrested at Heathrow Airport. 40 people tried to. The police were there to stop us getting arrested. 15 arrests happened. We also had a protest, and we also had a communications blockade, so you could participate at any level, including if you lived in Newcastle. We had a flash mob recently. There was a recent blockade of the tunnel. If you want to come on March the 8th, we'll be at Uxbridge Court supporting the defendants. We just did the quadrillion communications blockade. We're talking about media action, and we're also talking about an action around Barclays and fracking, which will probably follow the King's College climate emergency thing of graffiti, live graffiti. I think this is the last slide here too. So there's loads of actions we could do, you know, and it's, I guess the only bit of centralisation of power is that some of us have got access to the database and not everybody has, and that's for obvious reasons, and that's those of us that are taking the biggest risk with this thing anyway. But fundamentally, people could do what they want. When people think about bringing down this system and it feels like impossible to think about, I take great inspiration from a guy called Enrico, the Spanish guy, who took on debt deliberately to give away the money. He took on about, I think it was 300,000 euros of debt and just gave it away, no intention of paying it back. Imagine if 1 million of us did that. First we'd fuck up the finance system, which is ready to collapse anyway. I mean, part of us have to just be ready for collapse. But when you think, where's the money going to come from? Let's just borrow it and not pay it back. You know, let's refuse our debt. The money's there, you know, but we have to find each other and be willing to work together. Thank you.